Good afternoon. I'm Jim Townsend, and I am director of the Levin Center at Wayne State University Law School. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's presentation by Professor Kristin Taylor of Wayne State University. Thank you for joining us. Professor Taylor is this year's Levin Center Oversight Scholar and was awarded a stipend to conduct research on oversight of U.S. disaster policy. Professor Taylor will be speaking on her draft paper, which summarizes her research. Before turning things over to Kristin, I'm going to briefly describe the Levin Center and why Professor Taylor's work is so timely and so important to our mission. Then I'll turn things over to our presenter. After Professor Taylor gives her remarks, we will welcome Professor Rob DeLeo of Bentley University, who will provide a response to Kristin's paper. We'll then broaden the conversation and invite questions from our virtual audience. I invite all of you at any point here to submit questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And then at the end, when we're done, I'll return for a brief wrap-up. Now a word about the Levin Center. Former Senator Carl Levin founded the Levin Center in 2015 upon his retirement from the United States Senate, where he served for 36 years. The Levin Center is headquartered at Wayne State University's Law School in Detroit and also has a Washington, D.C. office. The mission of the Levin Center is to advance bipartisan fact-based oversight and civil discourse as instruments of change. At a time when our society and our politics are so deeply divided, we at the Levin Center believe that common ground can be found by working across party lines to pursue important facts and hold the government accountable for keeping its promises. And we are here to help legislators around the country do that. We pursue this mission through trainings and workshops with members and staff in Congress and state legislatures around the country, research, teaching, and commentary. Our website, social media posts, and podcast are designed to provide oversight researchers and practitioners and the public a one-stop resource for all things related to legislative oversight. Today, we are gathered to learn about how Congress and the Inspector General of the Department of Homeland Security each conduct oversight of the federal government's response to natural disasters. How much emphasis is placed on emergency response and recovery versus oversight of policies and programs to mitigate the effects of future disasters. With each passing month, we are confronted with fresh evidence of the urgent need to strengthen our nation's capacity to respond to the threat of natural disasters as our climate system becomes ever more volatile. Central to that effort must be robust oversight that examines not only compliance with program rules, but also the performance of policies that Congress has designed to rescue Americans from disasters and mitigate our vulnerability to future catastrophes. With the support of the Levin Center, Professor Kristin Taylor and her collaborator Stephanie Zarb have dug into the data on how Congress and the Inspector General go about carrying out such oversight. And they have come up with some unexpected conclusions that we hope will spur additional research and action to strengthen federal disaster policy. Now, a few words about our speaker, Kristin Taylor. She is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Wayne State University. Her research investigates the policy process, focusing events, policy failure and learning, policy narratives, and the politics of hazards and disasters. Dr. Taylor's work has been published in numerous journals, including Policy Studies Journal, Administration and Society, Review of Policy Research, the Journal of Regional Analysis and Policy, and others. I now want to turn it over to Kristin. Kristin, please take it away.
Great. Thank you for the warm introduction, Jim. I really, really appreciate it. I am going to share my screen. and get started on the presentation. So this research that I have done in collaboration with my doctoral student, Stephanie Zarb, is looking at the oversight of U.S. disaster policy. And I'd really like to thank the Levin Center at Wayne Law for the Oversight Scholar Fellowship that really supported this research and did a lot to spark my intellectual curiosity about the role of oversight in improving disaster outcomes. That's really where this came from. So just to give a bit of an overview, like Jim said, and many of us know from reading the news and from personal experience, this research is really motivated by a practical problem. Disasters are costly. They are increasingly expensive. They are increasingly severe, and the cost of disasters has exceeded $450 billion from 2016 and 2018. So, in terms of public policy, we have a real public problem. Increasingly severe disasters that are costly in terms of their damage to property, and increasingly subject to in communities where there are vulnerable populations of people who just don't have the means or capacity to bounce back after disaster. So that really motivates a lot of my research, and this one specifically because I come at this from the idea that our government should address public problems that have such widespread implications for people's livelihoods and lives. So the objective for this study, when I started out, was to better understand how oversight represents a means to assess policy attention. What do we know about oversight of disaster policy? Does it tell us anything different about policy attention and where Congress is looking or where agencies are looking and how they carry out the implementation of policies? What does it tell us about that? How can we better understand it by systematically analyzing oversight as a mechanism for policy attention, and then to examine that about disaster policy generally, and then about disaster mitigation policy specifically. And this is really the motivation that goes to protecting vulnerable communities and populations, to addressing a broad public problem that really doesn't have a political underpinning. It's the nature of disasters that we have to take steps to reduce their impact. So those are the big motivations for this particular study. And as an academic, I always ask a series of research questions. So when I started this out, I wanted to determine what is the focus of oversight of federal disaster policies and programs? And do different oversight mechanisms lead to variations in the types of programs that are the topics of inquiry? Because we have two mechanisms for oversight, right? We have agency oversight that the Department of Homeland Security, Office of Inspector General carries out over and oversees over FEMA. So they conduct investigations and issue reports and have findings about how FEMA can improve the delivery of services and programs. And then Congress has oversight power to make sure that policies and programs are meeting the goals that Congress laid out for them when they pass legislation to address a particular problem. So I'm really interested in whether that legislative oversight and that agency oversight lead to different types of inquiry. What are they looking at? And then finally, what is the potential effect of oversight on future disaster damage? And like Jim said, the Levin Center is very much interested in research, but also action. So what can we learn from the effect of oversight? How can we take that and translate it into better disaster outcomes for people and communities? So those are the overarching research questions that guide this study. The literature, I'm working in two different fields of literature here. And one is the oversight literature, particularly the literature that addresses issue attention in Congress. And we tend to think that issue attention or problem attention in Congress is driven by policy demand, right? There's a pretty clear there's pretty clear evidence that everyone can agree that there is a policy issue that we need to do something about. It can be driven by constituents calling and emailing and letting their congresspeople know that there's a problem going on in their district, and interest group activity and mobilization. So we think that those factors are what drive issue attention in Congress. And we know that there are two different types of oversight mechanisms: fire alarms, which we think is, which is where Congress they'll pay attention to an issue. A fire alarm will ring that there is some issue, some problem that their constituents are dealing with. And so they will direct their attention to it. And whether that's a disaster or whether that's something like a global pandemic or the implementation of the Affordable Care Act, some big fire alarm will ring and we will have to conduct oversight. Congress will have to conduct oversight. The other type of oversight mechanism that we have is this police patrol. And that's, if you think of a police officer on the beat, walking around looking for issues and problems that might come up in a community, agency oversight. So what the Department of Homeland Security and Office of Inspector General is doing, they're really conducting police controls. Is there regulatory compliance with the rules that FEMA has to use to implement disaster programs and policies? The other literature that I'm drawing on is the hazards and disasters literature, and particularly the politics of hazards and disasters. So there are a few things that we know historically, and that is that historically congressional attention has focused on the short-term response and short-term recovery. And so a lot of congressional attention has focused on how the chain of command worked in responding to a disaster. And that gets a lot of attention when things go wrong. So you can think about a lot of the oversight that went on and oversight hearings and investigations that went on after Hurricane Katrina. So those really provoke a lot of congressional attention. Because if the response is botched or flawed, there are real problems in how the federal, state, and local emergency management agencies work together. And the other thing that Congress has historically focused attention on is the short-term recovery, giving people individual assistance grants to local governments to pay overtime for police and fire and crews to remove debris and things like that. So short-term recovery, not necessarily long-term recovery that's intended to build sustainable communities that can be resilient after the next disaster, but mostly focused on clearing away the mess and getting life back to normal as it was the day before the disaster. And like I say, those are historically what we would expect and what the literature has said about Congress and hazards and disasters. Agency oversight has become increasingly important over time because of contracting out, right? We've had this devolution revolution since the 1980s, where government contracts out lots of goods and services. And so oversight, particularly OIG oversight of FEMA, has become critical as local governments and state governments contract out a lot of activities that FEMA provides money for. So that's what we think of. And going into this study and going into this project, what I expected to find was very little congressional attention paid to hazard mitigation, risks, long-term risks, severe repetitive risks. Because of what the literature had indicated, I really didn't expect to find a lot of that. I expected to find a lot of short-term disaster response, short-term recovery, and also sort of oversight of things that get a lot of attention, like individual assistance grants to people who have been affected by a disaster. And then there's popular media coverage about people using those to go out and buy a television or something like that. So I expected to see much more. My expectation was that I would see a lot of fraud, waste, and abuse types of oversight activities, not programmatic activities that were intended to reduce future risk. So that's what I expected. I did not find what I expected, which is heartening in many ways. And I'll get into that in a minute here. So I'm going to spend some time talking about the data and talking about the methodology because it's new to me. And I want to be really, really clear in how I talk about the analysis and how we got to our conclusions. So the study period for this project is 2016 to 2020. I focus on natural disasters. So not big infrastructure failures, not pandemic disease, so just natural disasters. The data that I used are sets of government documents. So the US Department of Homeland Security, Office of Inspector General issued 183 reports in the 5-year study period. They're posted on the DHS OIG website. So Stephanie and I grabbed those, pulled them down in PDF form and saved them. And at some point, the Levin Center will host those documents as a data set that people will be able to access. The other set of data that I used were United States Congress oversight. So documents from the United States Congress, both House and Senate, based on hearings that were conducted from 2016 to 20. And so during that time, that was the 114th, 115th, and 116th Congress. There were 50 congressional oversight hearings. And to gather these, we went to the Levin Center Oversight database. We searched every single committee in that time period, and we searched them for disaster, hazard, mitigation, flood, tornado, wildfire, FEMA, and FEMA. Those were the key search terms that we searched every single committee. So we grabbed those, we pulled those results, we tracked down the committee hearing minutes. For some of the committees, for some of the hearings, there were no minutes. So what we did was use the Wayback Machine or track the transcripts down from the hearings on the committee websites. So we were able to pull all of those together. This is a lot of text data, a lot of document data. And one thing that social scientists, political scientists struggle with is how to analyze and get their hands around such a thick data set like this. So what we did was use an innovative approach. We used machine learning, and we used a type of machine learning called topic modeling. And so topic modeling, if any of you are familiar with statistics and quantitative research, topic modeling is similar to factor analysis. And so what we did was we took the PDF documents of all the OIG reports and all of the committee hearing transcripts, and we fed them into a software program. And the software reads all of these documents, and it looks for clusters and patterns of words that occur in this data set. So words that co-occur together, keywords that occur over and over and over again. And what this approach does is it allows us to look through this large amount of text systematically. So this is some of the strengths of the approach. Some of the weaknesses that not all documents and texts are created equal. So while we were using government reports and hearing transcripts, some other documents can be more or less effective. So if you were going to look at a series of tweets or media coverage, the quality of what the document is really matters. So that's something that we just have to be careful about in how we handle the documents and how we conduct the analysis. And much like something like factor analysis, interpreting the results is both art and science. So we have to be careful about how we interpret the results of what the computer works through and spits out, to make sure that we're really being true to the patterns of keywords and terms that exist in the documents. And so I'm going to walk through our analysis process and walk through the results that we had. But just to give you an overview, our first step was to conduct unsupervised topic modeling. And this is where we took all of the documents, fed them into the software, and let the software use machine learning and artificial intelligence to find those keywords on its own. And I'll show you an example of that in just a minute. Then we looked at those results and built a dictionary, and then used that same approach with the dictionary to supervise a second run of the analysis. And then we did some frequency and proximity analyses. So those are the steps. And let me walk through those in each detail so you can understand what this process looks like and what the results that we got were. So in our first step of unsupervised topic modeling, this is just one example. So, and this for the OIG reports, this was the most frequent topic that came up, and we labeled it grant funds and business practices. So you can see here all of the keywords and clusters of words that emerge and form this pattern, right? So practices, grant, funds, insure, monitoring, account, subrecipient, recipient, grant funds, business practices, insure compliance, account for, and expand. So all of these and our interpretation of these results sort of led us to believe that how grant funds were administered and FEMA business practices were an important topic that emerged from the unsupervised topic modeling. Now, this is just one topic. There were other topics about mitigation, about the National Flood Insurance Program, about debris removal and disaster recovery. So there's much more of this in the paper, but in the interest of time, I just wanted to give you an example of what a piece of this results from the unsupervised topic modeling is. So the software scanned all of those documents, 183 OIG reports and 50 congressional documents, and found that there is this pattern, right? Grant and business and fund practices are really, really important in how we oversee disaster policy. So based on the results that we had, Stephanie and I worked through a process that we called building a categorization dictionary. So now that we had that raw data from the machine learning, we wanted to use our judgment, right? This is where the art and science part comes in. We wanted to use our judgment about how we were going to organize these topics into broad buckets. And so we came up with, based on the results of the unsupervised topic modeling, we came up with 5 buckets. One are these administrative practices that were a key area of importance for oversight. The next was disaster recovery. So this is another bucket of keywords and clusters that came up. The third was mitigation. And then the fourth and fifth were the National Flood Insurance Program and intergovernmental relations. So for each of these topics, we had some subcategories that we used the key terms that the software had identified in the first pass of the data to say that, well, when we're talking about, the administrative topic of disaster policy, we're really talking about premium pay and caps on premium pay. They're really talking about grant funds, compliance with minority and women-owned businesses, and fraud prevention. When we're looking at all of these documents, another topic that's really important is disaster recovery. And that's debris removal, housing repair, and other. And I have to say that the debris removal part of this dominates the recovery topic. It's almost 80% of the recovery topic. And then mitigation, so hazard mitigation. And we were really surprised to find that severe repetitive loss was one of the big categories that came up in that mitigation topic. So when we looked at all the key terms, severe repetitive loss was a really important category of mitigation from the documents, which is very heartening considering what we expected when we went into this. And then there was the National Flood Insurance Program, and we didn't identify any subcategories for that. And then intergovernmental relations, which we also didn't identify any subcategories for that particular piece of it. So that was step 2. Once we had this categorization dictionary, right? Which basically means that we had looked at the results that came out. We identified the most important topics, the most frequent topics, and we really had like an 80% threshold. So there had to be at least 80% of the key terms that were pinging in the documents. We use this to rerun the analysis of all of the documents, the OIG and the congressional documents. And what we found, we just ran some basic frequency analysis for today. So when we looked at the OIG documents, just to determine what the focus of their oversight activities were, out of 1,000, we had so on the right-hand side of the screen, in like 99% of the cases, so 99% of the documents, they were concerned with administrative, that administrative oversight. And then in 86% of the cases, recovery was a big part of it. The National Flood Insurance Program registered right around 10% of the documents. So only in 10% of the documents, the National Flood Insurance Program was mentioned. And then intergovernmental relations and mitigation were both like around the 55%. So in 55% of the cases, those terms were present. We were kind of surprised by that, right? In 50% of the, or 55% of the OIG documents, mitigation was mentioned, and we didn't expect that. So that kind of got our heads, or it turned on a light bulb, like, there's something going on here. And we'll circle back to that in just a minute. And then when we look at the frequency, the number of mentions overall, you can see that administrative, all of those administrative keywords and terms, they were at 1,000 compared to recovery, intergovernmental, and mitigation, which were they were just blown out of the water by administrative management of these disaster programs. So this is not surprising, right? We would expect that agency oversight would really be focused on regulatory compliance, administrative compliance, whether FEMA and FEMA's regional offices are administering grants and contracts the way that they're supposed to. And we would expect this for a couple of reasons, right? One, that's their meat and potatoes. And two, it's easy to conduct oversight on this. Did you have the proper documentation in place to make sure that you were issuing contracts effectively? Were you adhering to the women or minority-owned business requirements when you were issuing these contracts? Those are fairly easy things to check box and make sure that you're engaging in an oversight on. You're not really looking at the substance of whether a program is meeting its goals. Did we actually mitigate the effects of a disaster? I don't know, because we're really focused on contracts. So this is what we expected to find out of the OIG documents. This, the question that sort of that remained or persisted as we went through this is, how do we reconcile mitigation appearing in 55% of the cases, but only appearing like, less than 1,000 mentions in the documents. So it seems to be present in a lot of the cases, but not in a really, not in a way that suggests that they're taking it seriously. So we wanted to understand that a bit more deeply, and I'll touch on that in just a second. We also ran the same analysis on congressional oversight hearing documents. And in this analysis, we found something that we didn't expect. We found that mitigation was discussed in 88% of all the cases. So of the 50 hearings sorry, I've had too much coffee this morning. Of the 50 hearings that were conducted during the study period, 88% of them talked about mitigation, 94 of them talked about recovery, half of them talked about the National Flood Insurance Program, 88% of them were concerned with intergovernmental relations. So that relationship between federal, state, and local governments in implementing disaster policy. And then on the left-hand side of the screen, we see that recovery and mitigation are right there hand in hand, followed just behind by the National Flood Insurance Program, administrative and intergovernmental relations. So we were really surprised that mitigation was so prominent. And we were also really surprised by the stark difference between what OIG was looking at compared to what Congress was looking at. We expected them to be different, but not quite so different. And I'll talk about that and why I think that is in a little bit. So since we were really focused on hazard mitigation, is what kind of is oversight focused on mitigation? And if it is, what are they looking at in terms of mitigation? So we ran what's called a proximity analysis. What are the keywords that are paired with the word mitigation in all of the OIG report documents? And so we found that hazard mitigation co-occurs 58% of the time. Hazard mitigation co-occur 58% of the time. And the strength of the association is fairly strong, right? 0.69. We consider that a fairly strong association. And then we sort of see the other keywords that co-occur with it: program, disasters, improve, cost, ensure. So our interpretation of this is that in OIG reports, when they are talking about mitigation, when they are concerned with mitigation, they're really concerned with cost and improving the programs and the program management and implementation. So how do we ensure that the costs are being used in a way that effectively manages the program? That is how we interpreted this proximity analysis of the OIG reports, that proximity of mitigation with other keywords. In contrast, and this is the thing that we really, really found important and insightful about Congress's oversight of disaster policy, is that when we ran the same analysis, but for Congress, we had hazard mitigation that went together hand in hand, which we would expect. But we also saw flood, risk, disaster, property, program, insurance, resilience. So we saw other keywords that we thought were really important, because to us, they signaled not about the administrative implementation of a hazard mitigation program, but they signaled that Congress was really concerned about risk and protecting people and property, that they were really concerned about insurance and insurance costs. And we were really, really heartened to see that resilience was part of this too. So that ability to bounce back after disaster. And so going into this study, I had really expected to not find this. I had really expected to find lots of congressional oversight and hearings about fraud, waste, and abuse, about personal assistance grants. I had really expected to find lots of focus on how to better improve response, and that whether it's the National Incident Management System or the chain of command or coordination of a response. But what we found when we looked for this is that Congress is interested in risk. Congress is interested in the risks that people in their districts face. And they're interested in ways to how to address that. One of the things that we found when we dug a bit deeper into the transcripts was that much of what Congress was interested in were how the tools of hazard mitigation could be used or were being used, and whether that's the National Flood Insurance Program, whether that's buyouts, whether that's base flood elevations and flood mapping. They were really interested in overseeing the tools of mitigation that we have in place. And that's not something that neither I nor my collaborator really expected. We did a comparative analysis, and we kind of talk about this in the paper a bit, about how Congress is interested in people and the OIG is interested in in programs. And so basically in the congressional oversight documents, public health is a big concern. And I will note that we omitted all of the COVID documents from the 2020 year, but they're interested in disaster recovery. So 68% of the congressional documents dealt with disaster recovery. 42% talked about hazard mitigation compared to 29% of OIG documents and 26% of OIG documents that were concerned with recovery. In contrast, federal regulations for grants and contracts and federal programs, those were in 88% of the documents, none of the congressional oversight documents. Grant funds were a big, and the use of grant funds were a big factor in the OIG documents. 76% of them addressed grant funds in some way. And costs. Congress isn't really interested in cost, which is it's something that's curious, at least in this study. Congress wasn't really interested in the cost of any of this, but the OIG was. So that's a little food for thought. So to go back to the questions that I posed at the start of this, do different oversight mechanisms lead to the variation in types of programs that are the topics of inquiry? Yes. And so what we found is that the focus of oversight of federal disaster policy from the OIG perspective is this administration of grant programs, whether they're paying premium and overtime pay, what the caps on those are, and then the extent to which there is regulatory compliance about women and minority-owned businesses and fraud prevention. So those are what I think what we would, and as good citizens who have high expectations for government, we would and should expect. We want agency oversight to make sure that the people who are administering these programs to help communities prepare for, respond to, and mitigate disasters, we want to make sure that they're spending our tax dollars wisely. We want to make sure that they're doing their jobs, that they're crossing their T's and dotting their I's and complying with the law. So that's what we would expect. And it seems that the OIG is doing exactly that kind of oversight that we would want. Congressional oversight, on the other hand, is focused on recovery and mitigation. And really the mitigation piece that they're focused on are the impacts of hazards on people and infrastructure. Our take on this and our read of the data is that Congress really cares about people. They really cares about the impact of disasters on people. And from a mitigation perspective, these tools that we in the hazards and disasters field know exist to reduce the impacts of a flood, a hurricane, a tornado, a wildfire, whether it's base flood elevations, changes in building codes, flood mapping, hazard mapping, and a focus on addressing issues of severe repetitive loss and reducing future disaster costs. Those are things that Congress is concerned about, and we didn't really expect that. There's some literature that suggests that this mitigation and sort of long-term preparedness focus historically has only applied to certain kinds of disasters like earthquakes. And that can be explained by sort of the dread risk around earthquakes and not being able to predict them and having an organized and mobilized interest group around doing research on earthquakes and earthquake resilience. However, but we think that is not necessarily true for other types of disasters. We didn't find that in this. We found that across the board, Congress was really, really interested in mitigation and protecting people and communities. And so we're very heartened by that. And then to tie these findings back to action and think about what is the potential effect of oversight on future disaster damage. We think that congressional oversight that is focused on short-term tools and techniques to mitigate the effects of disasters are facing citizens in their districts. This has a huge potential effect on translating policies that we already have in place into action, into full and robust use in ways that address long-term hazard and risk. But also it signals that the public policy problem of hazards and disasters and the damages that are caused by this are something that's on Congress's long-term radar. And this idea that something like severe repetitive disaster loss is a long-term challenge, and that building resilience is a long-term goal, that those really carry with it the potential for Congress to do something profound. And for a scholar of the policy process, this idea that congressional attention to this issue as an ongoing item that's on the congressional agenda that has issue attention means that it increases the likelihood for policy change down the road that really has the potential to impact people and communities and make them safe in a disaster. So what are the implications of this research as we move forward? First and most strikingly is that the pattern of oversight activities is more robust than we anticipated. And so if we think about the interrelationship between agency oversight and congressional oversight, they're really looking at two important and different things. So there is this substantive area of interest for Congress, right? If they're really concerned about the substance of mitigation policies and risk reduction policies, that piece of it, that Congress is really looking at those things, but the OIG is really looking at procedural oversight. Is FEMA following the rules? Are they implementing the programs as designed? And so for future steps, we think that, or our argument is that this procedural and substantive relationship needs to come together in a way that helps solve another problem of disaster policy, and that is this intergovernmental relations piece of it. So what I didn't spend a lot of time talking about today, but I think is a thread that runs through this research, is that relationship between federal, state, and local governments to clearly send messages about what the goals and objectives of policies to address disasters are, the capacity for the federal government to send resources to states and locals in ways that allow them to have the ability to actually reduce their disaster risk. And then the politics of state and local governments of being willing to be on board with federal policy goals that will reduce disaster risk. So this intergovernmental web that is our system in which we implement disaster policy is something that oversight can really bring to bear its resources on, whether it's agency and procedural issues or whether it's substantive issues that Congress can look at. From someone who ordinarily studies, most of my research is on state and local government and disasters. This is an area where agency oversight could profoundly improve the way that FEMA interacts with state and local governments after a disaster. And from a substantive standpoint, Congress really has the ability to do some really significant bipartisan work on ways to address risk in communities to help people bounce back from disasters easier. So I think that there's a lot that these two oversight mechanisms can bring to improve disaster outcomes. So just to sort of wrap up here, I've run a little bit longer than I anticipated. We find that our findings didn't exactly square with the literature. And like I said, this is encouraging for risk reduction and good governance. But it also suggests that disaster experience and people's experience with disaster has changed over time. So while what might have been true about congressional attention to disaster 20 years ago may not necessarily hold now. And we need future research to understand how oversight of disaster policy has changed. So with that, I want to thank everyone for their attention and really welcome your questions and comments and feedback. So I will stop my share.
Great. Kristin, thank you so much for that wonderful review of your research. I'm now going to turn things over to Professor Rob DeLeo of Bentley University, who is going to provide an academic response to your paper. Dr. DeLeo is an associate professor of public policy at Bentley University and a visiting fellow in the program on crisis leadership at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. His research focuses on preparedness policymaking. His most recent book, Anticipating Policymaking When Government Acts to Prevent Problems and Why It Is So Difficult, examines the dynamics of policy change in anticipation of emergent hazards, like novel diseases and other types of slow onset events. His work has appeared in numerous peer-reviewed journals and edited volumes. Rob is also a founding member of the Risk and Social Policy Working Group, which is an interdisciplinary team of scholars examining the relationship between risk messaging and individual behavior during the COVID-19 pandemic. Rob, we so appreciate having you with us today. Please take it away.
Great. Thank you so much for that warm welcome. It's great to be here. And thanks to Kristin for inviting me to actually give some comments on her paper. So I'm going to start by saying that, over the course of my academic career, there have been a handful of moments when I've read a paper that's just so timely and fills such an obvious and important gap in the literature that I almost feel annoyed that I didn't do it first. And this is definitely one of those instances. The last few decades have really seen this proliferation of excellent studies, including some work that you've done elsewhere, Kristin, looking at the political, social, and institutional barriers to hazard mitigation policy. Concurrently, there's also been a wealth of studies looking at this same phenomena at sort of an agency level, or for lack of a better term, from the bottom up. If you were to do just a simple search in the Natural Hazards Review, for example, you'll unearth scores of public administration studies looking at the challenges associated with the successful implementation of these types of disaster mitigation policies that you talked about. But, it never really dawned on me, quite frankly, until I read your paper, that we don't know all that much about the linchpin that holds the implementation side and the policymaking side together. In this context is oversight. And this is a really problematic omission in our field, because I think, as you articulated so well, it's through oversight that we generate those feedback loops that hopefully result in good governance, hopefully result in the better administration and implementation of existing programs, and I would say most importantly, hopefully lead to lesson learning and policy change down the road. So I think this is a really important piece of scholarship that is going to not only inform the work that we do in the policy sciences, but will also open up all sorts of sort of applied avenues for investigating the value and function of congressional and agency oversight in these areas. The paper is, not surprisingly, really well written. You've gathered fascinating data. I found the topic modeling incredibly useful. I thought it was a great way to manage all of this qualitative information. I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that, as someone who has never actually used topic modeling in their own work, I thought this was one of the best explanations of the methodology that I've read in some time. So kudos to you for your clarity there. And I think that what's most interesting, and as you point out on page 14, this is actually sort of a heartening story for those of us who are interested in disaster politics. At first glance, I would almost go so far as to say that the system that you describe in this paper seems to be working exactly as it was designed, with the OIG monitoring and overseeing some of these sort of administrative minutia that are associated with federal programs, and congressional committees weighing in on some of the more heady, wonkish policy issues like flood zones and building codes and buyouts. All of the things that we would want these institutions to do. So if we take this finding on its own, you're right, we're really presented with a situation where not only does the system appear to be working better than many of us may have anticipated, but also the system may be tipping to a place where we're on the cusp of some really important policy change. So that, in my mind, is really incredibly exciting. At the same time, however, you and I, Kristin, know that at sort of a macro level, the system is not actually working as well as we'd want it to. And I struggled as a reader to sort of square this positive story with some of the other things that we know about congressional commitment to disaster mitigation and the reduction of emerging hazards. So if we sort of look at what the last 2 decades plus have looked like, we're actually presented with a very different story, and one in which Congress really hasn't taken the steps to address these issues. So one of the things that came into my mind, and I think it sort of dovetails your work, is the issue of flood zones and flood zone policy. And if we look just in the last year, FEMA's only flood mapping about a third of all rivers and streams, and about 46 to 50% of coastlines, despite the fact that you have organizations like the Association of Floodplain Managers that are saying you need to invest in greater flood mapping, especially in low population zones, which so far you've effectively ignored. And then, if we look outside of sort of natural hazards and in the public health domain, we're sort of presented with a very similar story where Congress is in fact not making the types of investments in mitigation programs that would have gone a long way towards helping this country navigate the COVID-19 pandemic, whether it's through investments in hospitals or surveillance capacity. So with all of this, as a political scientist, I guess the question that I would pose to you and Stephanie is, what gives? Why is it that these congressional agencies seem to be talking about the right things in these hearings, but when push comes to shove, they're still not acting? We're still not seeing this oversight activity translate into the policy that would in fact mitigate these hazards. Now, I have a couple hypotheses here. These are not fleshed out, but they hopefully they'll help you maybe address some of these in the paper, because these were the things I would ask as a reviewer. Hypothesis number one, I guess this is probably low-hanging fruit, but does does your topic modeling pick up on the nuances of the debate? For example, I went to a town meeting a couple years ago in a community that I had grown up in that was actually about EPA flood maps and FEMA flood maps and their impact on flood insurance in this community. And if I were to topic model the transcript from that, I would actually get a lot of hits on flood mapping and mitigation. However, it would not be in a positive way. It would actually be a lot of locals saying that these zones were too conservative, they're too costly, and we should do less of these things. Whereas you and I, Kristin, sort of know that actually they probably need to be more stringent, right? That actually the flood risks are higher than the people in this community may appreciate. And then secondly, what does all of this tell us about lesson learning, right? So is it the case that these committees are learning lessons, but those lessons aren't being translated into actual substantive ideas that congresspersons who aren't in those committees can sort of latch onto? So is there a breakdown at an institutional level in that, you know, these committees are sort of preaching to the choir, for lack of a better term, but their colleagues who maybe aren't as invested in hazard mitigation just aren't on board, and so we don't see the changes that we would expect. And then third, who is it in these committees that's talking about mitigation, and does the speaker matter? So on page 7, you said that the documents include written and oral testimony. So is it possible that your topic modeling is picking up on mitigation hits, but those hits are coming from the witnesses saying, hey, Congress, wake up. You need to worry about this. This is a really, really big idea. And then, you know, the committee members are sort of twiddling their thumbs. They're taking that information, but they're not responding in a way that says, yeah, we need to do this. So is it possible that what the topic modeling is picking up is actually an example of important information falling on deaf ears? So is that the source? So I'd love to know, like, who is the speaker, and do we see differences between those speakers? So do certain witnesses, are they more likely to talk about mitigation than others? And does that matter? I don't know. I think for me, I'm just trying to sort of square your findings with what we know about Congress, about what Congress has actually done in this space. And then I have one sort of final comment, and then I'll turn it over. I know we probably have a bunch of questions from the crowd. And that was, is it possible for you to extend the analysis a bit? You know, as you and I know, 4 years in sort of the lifespan of a policy domain is barely a blip on the radar. I don't think you have to, because you have so many documents. It's just such a treasure trove of information. I just wonder if the 2016 to 2020 period may not be representative of disaster politics, so to speak. I think that, you know, that's the nature of doing this work. But as we've seen, you know, a lot of these things have become hyper politicized under the Trump administration. So I wonder if even as a control, looking at, you know, the year or two preceding, or maybe the first year of the Biden administration, may give you some more leverage to sort of push back on a reviewer that flags that and says, well, you know, this is just Democrats trying to, you know, demonstrate virtue signal that they care about mitigation when, you know, the administration may not. I don't know, but, you know, I think you may consider doing that, especially since it looks like you all have come up with this crazy efficient way to deal with all of this data. So all in all, I love the paper. I look forward to seeing it in print soon, and I'm happy to chat more offline if it's helpful.
Great. Thanks, Rob. I really appreciate your feedback. I want to see if I can address a few of these issues that you raised, because looking at the Q&A, people have echoed similar things. And the easiest part first is the time frame. And so, and I like, as I look through this, I'm like, we need more time. Like we need more time. So, so my thought and my instinct is to look at 10 years. So look at 2010 to 2020. There were enough significant disasters that happened during that time. So we would get, I would imagine that we would get both like the focusing event, but we would also get the day-to-day business of oversight. So that's what my instinct does. And that would give us Obama and Trump, like politically, and shifts in Congress during that time too. So that would give us shifts in political focus from agency oversight, but it would also give us more than 2.5 Congresses. So the what gives piece of this, from a political science, public policy standpoint, I have also thought of this, and my what gives is that this is agenda setting, right? This is like in the positive spin of this data and this analysis, like this is a softening of the agenda, and that this is something that takes a lot, like this agenda, getting mitigation and getting long-term recovery and resilience on the agenda is something that takes a long period of time. And so in my mind, why hasn't there been more substantive change, more policy change, is because this is potentially agenda change in process. As people realize that this is a public problem that we need to pay attention to, Congress gets more of its constituents saying, hey, we have this flood and it keeps happening and we need to do something about it. And they realize that it's a problem and that we need to do so. And then throw in interest group activity like the floodplain managers, and that sort of build over time, I think is what this is, a slice of that. So this is agenda change in progress. And then the other piece about lesson learning, I think like in the next round of the analysis, looking at who's talking about mitigation, I think is the big important piece of it. So if it's the chairperson talking about mitigation, that's one thing. But if it's expert testimony talking about mitigation and it falling on deaf ears, or just being like another piece of this agenda setting sort of slow process, that's something different. So I really like the positive, like this is heartening, or at least it's heartening that this conversation is happening in Congress. But yeah, we need to pick apart who's doing the talking about mitigation. I appreciate your comments and I appreciate your feedback and your time.
Well, let me speak just on behalf of the Levin Center. Thank you so much, Rob, for that really nuanced and extensive response. I learned a tremendous amount just listening to both of you. We have an amazing number of awesome questions. We can go until, well, about 1:15 or 1:20. So I'm going to work very hard to get as many of these questions in, because they're of such high quality that I want to give them, every one of them, their due. The first set of questions come actually from a state representative from Iowa named Chuck Eisenhart, who is, I know, very active in oversight, and it's really thrilling to have his questions come in. One question he posed to the Levin Center, which I'll deal with right away, which is, he asks, could the Levin Center provide model language for formally requesting a state legislative inquiry into state disaster preparedness? And the answer is yes. We don't have that language at hand. I can't post it for people right now, but that is definitely something we could work on. And Chuck, we'd love to get your feedback on what you think language like that should look like. We have the benefit of looking at all 50 states and having input, and and having done some study of all 50 states and how they handle oversight. But we'd love to work on that with you and then post it and make it available to everyone in our audience. Another question is, does the acceptance of federal disaster aid by a governor trigger a requirement for state legislative oversight? In other words, does the federal government have anything in its rules, regulations that says, if you receive this money from the feds, you have to have mechanisms in place for state oversight? Kristin, Rob, do you all know of any such regulation?
I am not entirely sure if that regulation exists. I know that federal disaster aid requires that state and local governments adhere to their general contracting, procurement, and business practices that are on the books, that they're not allowed to operate outside of that. So I would imagine that any deviation from the administrative procedures that are already in place in the state would trigger some kind of red flag, but I'm not sure if there's anything that exists in the federal regulations that that would do that.
Another question that's sort of a sort of bigger picture question, and that is focusing on chronic endemic environmental hazards. This is really a question about definitions. At what point does a hazard become a disaster? And this, I mean, this is a question, obviously kind of a theoretical question, but I guess it's also a legal question with respect to FEMA's governing documents or the Stafford Act or whatever might be the governing law. Kristin or Rob, do you have a response to that?
So we sort of put like risk, hazard, and disaster in 3 different buckets. And you can think about risk as if you live in a flood prone area, risk is the likelihood that a flood is going to exist there. The hazard is the inundation of land with floodwater, right? So there's that, and the hazard is the condition, right? If risk is the likelihood it's going to happen, hazard is the condition, and then disaster is the occurrence. So you can think of it in those 3 particular places. Many people live in hazardous areas and deal with the risk of a disaster occurring again and again. And Chuck is from Iowa, so he is probably very, very pays a lot of attention to flood risk. Iowa has a huge flood risk. And there are lots of hazardous areas for riverine flooding in the state of Iowa. It doesn't become a disaster until the flood occurs. And so managing the hazard over time, managing the conditions is something that I think, and I argue, really demands a compelling government response. We can't just deal with it when it's a disaster. We have to address the hazard, the ongoing hazard, because that's not going away. Rob, I see you nodding. Do you want to?
I agree. I think it's a really interesting question. And I think as, political scientists, we would say in some respects, it's socially constructed, not that we don't have terms to differentiate between them, but whether or not government decides to pay attention to something is often a political question. So I would echo what Kristin said there, in that oftentimes government waits until we have a disaster before they act, when in fact there's a lot of literature that shows managing these chronic hazards not only saves money, but has an excellent return on investment in the long term, as opposed to waiting for the flood event or the hurricane to batter homes. Taking those steps preventatively is really quite important.
Mm-hmm. I want to jump to a question that's a little more technical that I think I noticed, and I think others might have noticed, that there's a real kind of, by a factor of 10, a difference in the association value that your data seems to show in the OIG reports, the OIG materials versus the congressional materials. For example, the term disaster has I guess a 0.4 association value in the OIG reports where it's much lower in the congressional oversight reports. And there seems to be a lower level of association in the congressional reports. Can you talk about that, Kristin, as to why that is or what that's telling us?
I think that, so why that is just it's the way people use the term hazards and disasters. So we often associate hazards with mitigation and not disaster mitigation. So we talk about reducing the hazard risk, mitigating the hazard risk. I am not real sure. I saw in the question that someone had asked about one of the analyses. Where is it in here? Someone had asked about magnitudes, and I have not run that analysis, but that will be the next iteration of this to look at what the magnitude is. I have my sense from the methodology is that it's primarily driven by the frequency count. So we had way more OIG documents than we did congressional documents, and that tends to skew those associations. But that's my gut at this point. But we need to run the rerun the analysis to address the magnitude issue. And I think it's because we're not holding them as equals, just because there are so many more OIG reports than congressional documents.
I see.
Yeah.
Another question came up that you touched on just briefly, but I think it bears maybe focusing on a little bit more is the impact of the political party leadership of Congress. Who's in control of Congress or who's in control of the White House? How do you think that would influence your findings, or how did that influence your findings? Obviously, your findings spanned, the end of the Obama administration, and then pretty much the entirety of the Trump administration, and then a change in control of the House after 2018. So
this was a really interesting piece of the research that I want to dig into a bit more. Essentially, on the OIG investigations, what we found was that most of them occurred in the last years of the Obama administration. Almost overwhelmingly, that was when the majority of the oversight investigations occurred. Now, some of these have like a timetable to them. Like there were a few very prominent disasters that had occurred and were winding down. So in that sense, like there were like the tail end of old Hurricane Katrina contracts and grants that were being investigated, and some of the older, much older disasters. So those contracts and grants have been winding down and they were closing and under investigation. And so from a timing standpoint, that kind of makes sense, right? Like that would occur earlier in the time period, but there were almost no investigations and reports, or very few, when the Trump administration began. So I think that there is some political piece of that to the agency oversight. And in terms of the congressional oversight, I didn't really see a big difference between the Congresses. But that doesn't mean that they don't exist. And I would kind of expect that they would exist, if only because the Levin Center, their scorecard for oversight for each of these committees, from one committee to the next, they went from an F to an A or an F to a B. So my hunch is that there probably is a difference, but in terms of, I think that understanding that difference would and will require digging into who testifies, what types of hearings they have, the chairperson's statement, and things like that. So I think that the who is coming to testify matters.
So that actually that speaks to a question that we have, that where a member of the audience asked about the possibility of coding by the people testifying, or somehow being able to identify that and have that be a variable in the analysis.
Yeah, I think that's on the next cut of the analysis.
Because it could speak to that issue that Rob brings up, which is the nuances. I mean, it matters a lot, the context of how these terms are coming up. It's not just the frequency and where they show up. It's kind of who's saying it, and often what are they saying it for?
Yeah. That what are they saying it for is I think digging into the people who are testifying, I think that'll help address that.
I want to ask you about a question that several people raised, or a topic that several people raised, and that has to do with the social vulnerability of the populations that are affected by disasters. To what extent do you see anything? Did the data at all suggest an increased awareness of the social vulnerability of certain populations? So if you'd answer about that, and then we had another question that asked specifically about undocumented populations. Were there was there any data or anything coming up about undocumented migrants and their vulnerability?
There was nothing that came up about undocumented migrants and their vulnerability. I can tell you from the analysis that that social vulnerability of particular groups came up in congressional documents, and it came up in the context of specific disasters. And both Hurricane Rita and Hurricane Harvey were two disasters which prompted Congress to hold oversight hearings about pockets of social vulnerability and community resilience. So my working hypothesis is that these issues of social vulnerability and resilience and pockets of vulnerability in communities, which in my mind would definitely include undocumented migrants, that those are issues that will come up on a disaster by disaster basis. Is there a threshold for when we start talking more broadly about social vulnerability and pockets of vulnerable groups within communities? I certainly hope so. Because all of what we know in the disaster research field is that not everyone bounces back from disaster at the same way and at the same rate and with the same success. And so things like addressing the most vulnerable pockets in your community, pockets of people in your community, is increasingly important for ensuring resilience.
We have time for just to touch on a couple more questions. Again, more great questions from the audience. We have a question about other government agencies that might play a role in oversight, and one of them being the Government Accountability Office. What role do you think they might play in this? They're obviously an arm of Congress. Do you know anything about what they've traditionally done in this area?
I know that the GAO has issued reports on disaster program implementation and the effectiveness of that. I focused on the OIG and the congressional hearings because in law, those are the two mechanisms that we have to oversee. Government activity. With that being said, a lot of what is done, or some of what is done, enough of what is done around hazard mitigation, particularly with housing and community development, is not done in FEMA. It's done in HUD. And a lot of the really innovative stuff that is done around hazard mitigation is done in HUD through their community development block grant program. So what I'd like to do is include a focus on HUD. And the other piece of this that's around hazard mitigation that is more structural in nature is what the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers does. And so I would be interested in expanding the scope of this to see if there are any OIG reports from the Department of Defense about what the Corps does.
We also had an audience member who suggested or wondered why there wasn't a focus on the Department of Health and Human Services ASPR reports.
I am not familiar with those reports, but I'm going to chase them down.
Okay, because that wasn't something I was familiar with. So we'll check that out. Well, we are just really about out of time. I will just wrap things up by saying thank you to you, Professor Taylor, for your wonderful work and for coming today to summarize where you are with this research, which I think is really providing some important new answers and some important new information that, of course, is then opening up more questions about the role of oversight and the impact of oversight on disaster policy. Professor DeLeo, we can't thank you enough for providing a lot of really interesting insights and new ways of thinking about this that certainly we had not thought of. So your contribution has been so valuable as well. And really, I think the headline here, there were so many ways to summarize this, but I would just say that the good news that I think does seem to come out of this research, which is that mitigation is something that is getting more attention than was anticipated or what the conventional wisdom tells us, also begs a very important question, which is something that I don't think that has been studied enough, and that is the interaction or the relationship between oversight and policy change, and the lag factor, the time that we can anticipate will occur. And there's so many obviously modalities and things that go into that process. And like so many things in oversight research, there's a great deal more to do. But today's conversation, I think, raised a lot of important issues. And I know it was very enjoyable for those of us at the Levin Center who were privileged to have you with us.
Thank you very much. And thanks to the Levin Center for supporting this work. You really, you and Elise and Margot have really been instrumental in fostering this project along, and the Levin Center has really been fantastic for sparking my intellectual curiosity about what oversight can do in this nexus of procedure and substance. So I'm grateful for the support.
Well, we're grateful for your work. A reminder to everybody who's watching that this is being recorded, so that if you want to come back and read, watch parts of it or share it with others, we will have it posted very soon on our website. And so we hope you'll take advantage of that resource, as well as a lot of other resources we have at the Levin Center's website. So with that, we'll bid everybody a good afternoon. And again, thank you to Kristin and Rob for your wonderful contributions.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So long.